Hello everybody and welcome to my Dominaria United draft guide. In this video, I'm going to be giving you all of the information you need to find success in your Dominaria United drafts. I will be discussing the set mechanics, top commons, archetype overviews, combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Let's get started. These set mechanics are Enlist, Read Ahead, Domain, Kicker, and Stun counters. Starting things off with Enlist, it is a mechanic on creatures that reads, as this creature attacks, you may tap a non-attacking creature you control without summoning sickness. When you do, add its power to this creature's until end of turn. So basically, it lets you use your other creatures that are in play to buff the creature that has Enlist when it is attacking. So it's a nice way to push through extra damage with creatures that otherwise might be blanked. Read Ahead is a new mechanic on sagas that lets you start at whichever chapter you choose instead of chapter 1. So it's basically a normal saga, but instead of starting at chapter 1 and then going 2, 3, you can choose to start at chapter 2 and then go to chapter 3, or you can just choose to start at chapter 3 and then have the saga go away immediately. The next mechanic is Domain. It is very simple. It basically rewards you for having a large number of basic land types in play. So there are 5 basic land types, one for each color of mana, and so Domain is going to scale from 1 to 5 depending on how many of those you have in play. Kicker is another mechanic that is returning, and this is going to be a way to spend a little bit of extra mana when you cast a card and get a little bit of an extra benefit. So with Hurloon Battle Hymn, it is 3 mana to deal 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker, but if you do have an extra white mana, you can gain 4 life as well. Next is Stun counters. This is a new mechanic to represent creatures being locked down for a temporary basis. So with Impede Momentum, you tap a creature and put 3 stun counters on it, which means if a permanent with a stun counter would become untapped, remove 1 from it instead. So it's basically locked down for 3 turns. Moving on to the top commons, starting with white. At number 1 is Citizen's Arrest. This is just a great removal spell that permanently removes the creature from play instead of previous white removal spells that have left the creature in play, like something like a pacifism effect. And the benefit of removing the creature from play is that the opponent is not going to be able to use it for its passive abilities. They're not going to be able to sacrifice it for value, and it's much harder for the opponent to do something like return the creature to their hand with a bounce spell and then play it again if you have used Citizen's Arrest, which is why this is a great removal spell and the top white common. At number 2 is Argivian Cavalier. It's a nice 3-drop that gets you 2 bodies for 1 card. It has Enlist, so it's going to be able to continually attack throughout the game and always threaten to trade with your opponent's creature. It also has great synergy with all of the white decks in the format because a lot of the white decks benefit from having 2 creatures for 1 body. And then at number 3 is Samite Herbalist. This is a nice 2-drop that can get you some nice card filtering and a little bit of life gain by scrying one and gaining a life whenever it becomes tapped, which does include attacking, but it also has the added benefit of being a great card with Enlist cards, because if you do use the Samite Herbalist as the Enlist creature, you're going to be not only giving the creature +2 power, but also getting the Samite Herbalist trigger, because when you Enlist, you do tap that creature. So it's a nice 2-drop for white decks, but any deck that has Enlist is going to be extra happy at using it. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Soaring Drake. It might seem very simplistic as a 3-mana 2/3 flyer, but this is actually a very good card because normally a flyer would be something like a 2/2, which means that when you play it on turn 3, it doesn't actually stop your opponent's 2/2 creatures from attacking you. So this means that you're going to be able to use it to somewhat stabilize and then also pressure your opponent due to its flying ability, which evasion is almost always just a great ability in limited. Moving on to number 2 is Essence Scatter. This is a great interactive spell for blue that can stop any problematic threat your opponent is trying to cast while it is on the stack. And then at number 3 is Tolarian Geyser, which is a great card in any blue deck, even if it doesn't have the ability to use the white kicker ability. Just bounce your opponent's creature, get you a little bit of breathing room, and draw a card so you don't put yourself behind on card advantage. It's also a nice combo with Essence Scatter because you can bounce your opponent's problematic creature and then counter it on the way back down with Essence Scatter if you do have both of those cards. Moving on to black, at number 1 is Phyrexian Rager. It is just a great medium-sized creature that is relatively cheap and gets you some value. So just kind of a nice combination of stats and abilities and a nice bit of value packed into one little card, and that means it is going to be the top black common. At number 2 is Extinguish the Light. It's unconditional removal, it's instant speed, it even gains you some life if you do cast it for a mana disadvantage by killing a creature that costs less than Extinguish the Light, which means that you're overall just going to be very happy playing this card in your black decks. And then at number 3 is Splatter Goblin, which is a nice 2-drop creature for black that is going to be able to trade with creatures a little bit higher up the curve, or sometimes even threaten a 2-for-1 if your opponent does have any 1 toughness creatures lying around. Moving on to red at number 1 is Lightning Strike. 2 mana, deal 3 damage, instant speed, any target. Overall, just a great card. It has historically been an uncommon at many points in Magic's history, so seeing this at common is a great sign and is a great card for your red decks. At number 2 is Yavimaya Steel Crusher. It's a 2 mana 2/2 that has some extra hate against artifacts built in, but the real main benefit of this card is Enlist, which means that even if your opponent plays a reasonably sized blocker, you're going to be able to keep attacking with that Yavimaya Steel Crusher and potentially threaten a trade with your opponent's more expensive cards. And then at number 3 is Coalition War Brute. It might seem unimpressive as a 4 mana 3/4 trampler, but once again, Enlist makes this card a very scary threat in the mid game when you're trying to push those final points of damage or just bash through your opponent's big creatures. Coalition War Brute is going to be a very scary card to see on the opposing side of the battlefield when you are trying to stabilize. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Bite Down. This is the best type of removal that green tends to get. It's an instant, and it is a bite spell instead of a fight spell, which means that your opponent's creature is not going to do damage back to your creature as it would in a typical fight spell. So if you have a 3/3, you can kill your opponent's 3/3 without worrying about that being a trade. At number 2 is Magnagoth Sentry, a 4 mana 4/4 with reach. Might not sound super impressive, but it is just a very beefy body, and reach means that it is going to help you stabilize a great deal against a wide variety of decks in the format if you're trying to do something in the late game, and it's also just a nice attacker as a 4 mana 4/4. And then at number 3 is Sunbathing Rootwalla. It's a simple 2-drop, 2 mana 2/2, but if you can get to the mid or late game and you have some domain enabled, then you giving it +2/+2 is pretty much expected, and giving it +3/+3 or even more makes it a great card to have in your deck. Moving on to the color rankings, I will first note that all of the colors are pretty solid, but these are just some rankings for if you are trying to make a close pick and need a tiebreaker. Red is coming in at number 1. It just has a great suite of early creatures and also some great removal spells, and because of the Enlist mechanic, the creatures are going to be able to stay relevant much later into the game. Black comes in at number 2. Phyrexian Rager is just a fantastic common. Black also has some great removal spells and overall just good interaction and creatures as well as some value built in. White coming in at number 3. It just has great synergy with all of the other colors in the format. It has a lot of cards that are very flexible and good in a variety of strategies, and it does have Citizen's Arrest as a great removal spell. Blue coming in at the lower end of the spectrum, but it is by no means a bad color. It does have some good instants and sorcery synergies and also has some pretty solid creatures as well. It just struggles from a lack of interaction once your opponent's creature gets into play, which is why it's on the lower end of the spectrum. And then green comes in at the worst color for this set, but it is worth noting that green decks in general have a lot of synergy by splashing around and playing multiple colors. So even if it is the worst standalone color, it does have some great cards that are good in specific color combinations. So it might have a great green, white, gold card or a great blue, green, gold card. And so even though it is the worst individually, it is actually a pretty powerful color to have in your particular deck. Moving on to the archetype overviews, starting off with red-white. This is an aggressive strategy that even has some go-wide synergies built in. It can use Torre Davenant as a way to buff your creatures when it attacks. It has Baird, Argivian Recruiter as a nice 2-drop that can slowly grow you an army. It is worth noting that if you have Enlist creatures and those creatures survive until your end step, they will have power greater than their base power, so you will create that soldier token. And then at common, you gain access to Keldon Strike Team as a way to push damage by making a bunch of creatures all at once and giving them all haste, and just being a card that is just great in your red-white deck. Moving on to blue-black, this is a value, grindy, like controlling strategy that also benefits from casting a lot of instants and sorceries. So at uncommon, it gains access to Rona, Sheoldred's Faithful, which will slowly drain your opponent out as you cast instants and sorceries and be a nice recursive threat. It also has access to Vohar, Vodalian Desecrator, which is going to filter your draw very nicely, while also making your opponent potentially lose life while you gain life, and then can even cast instant or sorcery from your graveyard once you get some nice ones to recur it back into your graveyard. And then Tribute to Urborg is a nice card that blue-black gains access to that is a medium card in other strategies, but quite good if you are able to enable its kicker cost, especially with other instants and sorceries in your graveyard. Moving on to green-white, this is a strategy that cares about having a lot of creatures in play and also potentially some domain and splashing payoffs. It has Queen Alanal of Ruidoc as an uncommon, which benefits from creating tokens and having a wide board. It's got Zar Ojanen, Sire of Afrava, which is a way to buff all of your creatures as well as benefit from having a higher domain count, so having maybe another color in the mix. And then Scout the Wilderness is the perfect mesh of the two. It can get you an extra color or just ramp you to synergize with any domain cards and also get you a couple of soldier tokens if you are trying to do something with tokens. And so it's just the perfect card for a very synergistic, maybe go wide strategy. Moving on to blue-red, this is a deck that cares about casting instants and sorceries. It can use Najal the Stormrunner as a way to cast sorceries with Flash, which can be very tricky. It can also copy your instants and sorceries when it is attacking if you have a couple of extra mana lying around, which is quite nice as well. Balmor Battle Mage Captain is a cheap, evasive creature that can buff your other creatures with +1/+0 and trample, which is really nice if you are chaining together some instants and sorceries. And then Gitu Amplifier is the sort of card that looks a little bit small as a 2-mana 1/2, but once you start casting instants and sorceries, it becomes a very problematic threat very quickly. And also in the mid to late game, if you do draw it, it has that kicker ability as extra upside. Moving on to black-green, it is a graveyard mid-range strategy. It can use Urg, Spawn of Turg, to filter your draws, fill your graveyard, and set you up for your other synergies. It has Bortuk Bone Rattle as a great uncommon that can get you some value by returning a creature from your graveyard to your hand, or even maybe into play if you have a high enough domain. And then Urborg Repossession is going to be a great card in this black-green deck because you'll be able to pay the kicker cost and get a nice 2-for-1 built in with your graveyard synergies. Moving on to white-blue, this is a deck that cares about casting instants and sorceries, but also cares about having a wide board of creatures. So Wrath, Weatherlight, Stalwart really rewards you if you have a couple of untapped creatures when you're casting instants and sorceries, as it will continually fuel you by drawing you extra cards and helping you draw into more creatures and more instants and sorceries. And then it also has the ability to buff all of those creatures with its second ability. And then Tura Kennerud Sky Knight is a 5-drop 3/3 flyer, which is a little bit small for this modern era of limited, but whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you create a 1/1, which can spiral out of control very quickly. And then Protect the Negotiators is a great card for this blue-white strategy because it's going to be an instant or sorcery. It's going to reward you if you do have a lot of creatures already in play. And if you're paying the kicker cost, it's even going to give you a creature so you can start maybe getting a wide board or an army amassed. So just a nice card for this blue-white strategy. Moving on to red-green, it has a little bit of aggression, a little bit of mana ramp, a little bit of domain. It's kind of got a lot going on depending on which direction you want to take it. Rulik Mon's Warren Chief can attack and maybe ramp you if you have lands on top of your deck, or grow you a little bit of an army if you don't. Rada Coalition Warlord is a pretty scary attacker if you have a reasonably sized domain, maybe 3. Is at that point where it becomes really scary, and it is the sort of card that plays great with combat tricks because your opponent is going to want to block it. And then Sprouting Goblin is a nice red uncommon that plays particularly well in red-green because you can enable its kicker cost to either get a land for a splash color or just to enable an extra domain. And then in the late game, if you do have a lot of extra lands in play, you can start sacrificing them to draw cards. Moving on to white-black, this is a strategy that cares about having a lot of creatures in play. You can use Aaron Benalia's Ruin to sacrifice a disposable creature to buff all of your other creatures. Alas Il Core gets you a little bit of life whenever a creature enters play for you, and makes your opponent lose life whenever a creature you control dies, which is a really scary combination on a card that's already solid as a 2-mana 2/2 Death Touch. And then Benalish Sleeper is a mediocre 2-drop without the kicker ability, but if you are able to use its kicker ability and sacrifice a very meaningless creature to you, like a 1/1 token, and have your opponent sacrifice a reasonable creature, then all of a sudden Benalish Sleeper becomes quite good. Moving on to blue-green, this is a strategy that cares about getting a lot of lands into play, a lot of different types of lands into play, and overall is the splashiest and most mana rampy color combination in the format. Tetyover Steward of Tides makes sure that your lands are not going to be put to waste if you do continually put them into play, because eventually they'll start turning into 3/3 creatures with haste and flying. Nile Avizoa Aeronaut is a nice little way to filter your draws if you are building up a domain, because you'll start to be able to attack your opponent, kind of stack your deck the way you want, and if you ever do get a full domain of all 5, you're even going to be able to get card advantage from it. And then Vineshaper Prodigy is the perfect card for a blue-green deck, because it's a reasonable 2-mana 2/2 if you need it to defend in the early turns, but once you have a lot of lands in play, you can use its kicker ability to start making it a 2-for-1 creature, which is overall quite nice. Moving on to red-black, this is a strategy that is more aggressive side of sacrifice and graveyard synergies. Garna, Bloodfist of Keld, rewards you if your creatures are dying in combat, or just dying in general by pinging the opponent. Lagamos, Hand of Hatred, gives you a disposable body every combat that you're going to be able to use for sacrifice synergies and also to just pressure your opponent. And if you have 5 creatures die in a turn, you can even search for a card and put it into your hand. And this does include your opponent's creatures as well. So if there is a big combat where a bunch of things trade off, keep that in mind that it does include your opponent's creatures. And then Balduvian Atrocity is a mediocre card on its surface as just a 3-mana 2/3 menace. But if you're able to pay the kicker cost, you can bring back a creature from your graveyard temporarily. You can either use that for its enters the battlefield effect, you can sacrifice it to any number of things, or you can just use it to help pressure your opponent by hitting them for some extra damage. So overall, a nice card in this red-black strategy. Next up, we will be looking at the combat tricks. These are the ones that are available at common. In white, there is Take Up the Shield and Heroic Charge. Heroic Charge in particular is pretty scary. If your opponent does have a wide board and makes an alpha attack, you need to be aware of the fact that this card exists. In blue, there is Shore Up and Timely Interference. It's definitely worth noting that Shore Up untaps the creature, and also worth noting that Timely Interference is a relatively small impact on combat that is somewhat easy to play around, but if they do get you with it in the early turns, it can have a pretty devastating effect. So make sure that you aren't just trading your 2/2 with their 2/2 without thinking, because if they kill your guy and draw a card, that's going to be pretty bad for you. In black, there is Battle Rage Blessing, which is a bit expensive for a combat trick at 2 mana, but is going to win you the combat if it doesn't get interacted with. In red, there is Furious Bellow, which is a quite nice combat trick. We have seen +3/+0 and First Strike many times in the past, and adding Scry 1 to that is a nice improvement. And then in green, there is Gaia's Might and Colossal Growth. So those are all of the combat tricks at common. Once you move up to uncommon, there are a few more. Join Forces can be particularly scary, +2/+2 to 2 different creatures, and untapping them is definitely something that is the potential to blow a game wide open. In red, there is Twinferno, which can give a creature double strike. There is Warhost's Frenzy as another mass pump spell to be aware of if your opponent makes a suspicious attack with all their creatures. And then in green, Strength of the Coalition can be a mediocre combat trick, but when paired with white and the Kicker ability, it can turn into a massive blowout combat trick that can affect the entire combat step. Moving on to some trap cards that are best avoided. Floriferous Vinewall, which, while fun to say, is not a particularly great card because a 2-mana 0/2 defender just doesn't have a large enough impact on the game. Even if it does replace itself with a land, it's basically like a 2-mana gain 3 or 4 life and like draw a land, which is just not worth playing in limited. In Joint Exploration is the next trap card. It is a fine card to play, but it is definitely much worse than it looks. We have seen Deliberate in the past, which was this same effect at common, but it didn't have the Kicker ability, and Scry 2 draw a card is just not a super impactful card in limited and not something you have to prioritize. While it is a card you can play, the Kicker ability doesn't add as much utility as you might think, and so overall Joint Exploration is just not the best card to prioritize in your drafts. And then Phoenix Chick is another card that is a trap because it's easy to look at this card and imagine playing it on turn 1 and pecking in for a lot of damage, but the problem is that sometimes you'll draw this card on turn 5, and by that point of the game, a 1/1, even if it does have flying, isn't going to be super relevant. It can't block, which means that it isn't even able to chump block in the mid turns. And a lot of the times when you would be attacking with 3 or more creatures to trigger its secondary ability, you are already in pretty good shape because you're attacking with a lot of creatures already. So Phoenix Chick is a card that's best left avoided unless you're a hyper-aggressive strategy. Moving on to some combos that you can assemble in this format. The classic combo has returned, the steal your opponent's creature and then sacrifice it. Enthrall to the Pit also has the Kicker ability, so you can steal your opponent and sacrifice it all in one if you're playing a black-red deck. But oftentimes getting up to 7 mana is going to be pretty tricky, so you can combine it with a card like Bone Splinters to just sacrifice your opponent's creature for just 5 mana and get a nice little bit of value there. Moving on to another cool combo that is solely in white, you can use Clockwork Drawbridge to tap your opponent's creature and then Artillery Blast to deal damage to a tapped creature. So it turns a non-permanent removal spell in Clockwork Drawbridge and a situational removal spell in Artillery Blast into a total removal spell, which is quite nice if you have both of those cards. Next is Captain's Call plus Heroic Charge. We already talked about the benefits of having Heroic Charge with a wide board of creature, and Captain's Call gives you 3 creatures for 1 card, so definitely a scary card, and turns a 3-powered attack into a 9-powered attack. And then the final combo to be aware of is Coalition Warbrute plus Twinferno, or really any card that can get a high power relatively quickly plus Twinferno, because Double Strike is the sort of mechanic that gets scarier if your opponent has a very high-powered creature, and Coalition Warbrute happens to be a common, we already discussed it, that can get a very high power for relatively low setup costs. So you just play your Coalition Warbrute, you maybe tap another 3-powered creature, you attack them for 6/4 with Trample, and then all of a sudden you give it Double Strike and hit them for 12 out of nowhere. So that's definitely a good combo to be aware of. Moving on to the mana fixing in this set. First and foremost is the Idyllic Beachfront cycle. This is a cycle of 10 tapped dual lands that have the land types of both of those lands. So Idyllic Beachfront is a plains island, so it can tap for blue or white mana. And the reason this is especially relevant in this set is because it does work with domain. So Idyllic Beachfront gives you 2 domain for just 1 card. So if you are trying to play a multicolored deck, using these lands to fix your mana and also give you some domain can be quite nice. And there is one for every color combination in the set. Next is Crystal Grotto. This card is a little bit on the weaker side of mana fixing, but if you do need fixing in a pinch, it can get you there. And the fact that it scries one is nice improvement on previous iterations of this effect that we have seen in the past. Salvage Mana Worker, on the other hand, is a better version of this effect than we've seen recently, which is a 2-mana creature that is colorless, that can pay 1 mana to add a mana of any color. Normally, this would cost 2 mana to activate, and so the fact that you don't actually have to put extra mana into it, you just get to pay 1 mana, get a mana back of any color, is really nice, and means that this will be able to fix your mana in the early turns of the game, and even later on if you do need that mana. It is worth noting that creatures are less reliable as mana fixing because they might trade or your opponent might kill them, so don't use this as your sole source of splashing, but it can be a nice supplemental source. Next is Relic of Legends, which is a little bit slow and expensive if you don't have other legendary creatures, but it does tap to fix your mana for any color, and if you have some legendary creatures, those can even be turning into a mana ramp. And then finally, for the colorless color fixing, we have Meteorite, which is a bit expensive at 5 mana, but it is a little bit of interaction by dealing 2 damage, and it can tap for mana of any color, so if you are trying to splash a late game card, it can be a nice addition to your deck. In green, there is also some fixing. We have Deathbloom Gardener, which as a creature does have the same problem as Mana Worker. It can't really be a source on its own because your opponent might just kill it, but it's a nice supplemental source and some ramp as well. Scout the Wilderness is a card we already discussed. It's mediocre fixing outside of green-white, but if you are in green-white, it is fantastic fixing. And then Weatherseed Treaty is a premium fixer at uncommon. It gets you a land of any basic land, and then you can also just get some a creature out of it, and even a little bit of a domain payoff at the end. And then finally, Slimefoot's Survey is a very interesting fixer because it just says a land with a basic land type, so it can get you these dual lands like Idyllic Beachfront. So if you use Slimefoot Survey, you can potentially get up to 4 basic land types because you can get like a blue-white dual land and also a black-red dual land, and then all of a sudden you have a ton of different colors to work with, a ton of different domain, and it even does help you set up your next draw step as well. Moving on to some final tips in this format, Enlist makes blocking much more difficult for a lone big creature, so small creatures that can trade are more necessary. In some limited formats, you can rely on stabilizing the board by playing something like a 4-mana 4/4 or a 4-mana 3/4, and just making it so your opponent's 2/2s and 3/1s can't attack past it. However, because Enlist is in this format, a lot of the 2/2s or small creatures are going to be able to somewhat gang up and make it so that your bigger blockers aren't able to hold the ground as effectively as they would be in other formats. So make sure that you have smaller creatures that can trade with those 2/2 Enlist creatures, because it's worth noting that Enlist doesn't buff the toughness, it only buffs the power. So if the creature's a 2/2, it's still going to trade for your 2/2 if you're trying to block it. So keep that in mind when you are choosing your creatures from a strategy perspective. And then the final tip is if you have enough domain payoffs, you can play a half on-color dual land to get more basic land types. So if you're playing a blue-green deck that really cares about domain, maybe you can also play a blue-red land just so that you have a mountain type built into your mana base to potentially fuel some of your domain payoffs. Now, I wouldn't recommend playing a fully off-color land like a black-red land in your blue-green deck, but playing a half on-color land can be worth it if you have enough domain payoffs and you don't have to worry about paying the tap land, because playing a tap land is a big cost and limited, but if you have enough reasons to do so, it can be worth doing. So that is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more draft content, and comment below with your questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave hashtag Dominaria Drafter in the comments section down below. That is going to do it for this video, though. I hope you enjoyed it. Good luck in your Dominaria United drafts, and I'll talk to you next time.